Given the Georgia Bulldogs' success in recent years, last season was really a big disappointment. But how about 2025? What does that look like? What does the schedule look like? What does the projected record look like for this upcoming season? We're going to break it all down for you. And just really quickly, if you're a Georgia fan, please check out our Georgia channel. Go subscribe. Georgia show every week and content throughout the week. So again, check it out. Subscribe if you're a Georgia fan. Georgia wound up having one of the toughest schedules in the country last season. You looked at it preseason, and yeah, it looked like a tough schedule, but some of the teams that they played wound up being, maybe a little bit better than we thought. And yeah, it turned out to be a really, really tough schedule. So we all know that the conference schedule is going to be the same. You're just going to flip the home and away. So let's break it all down for you here in this video. And again, we're going to just start by looking at the schedule, and we will go to the non-conference game. So that's really going to be the biggest change this year. No Clemson on the schedule. Instead, they will have Marshall, Austin Peay, Charlotte, and then they will play Georgia Tech at the end of the season. So a much easier non-conference schedule. Marshall is not a bad team, although I guess they did lose their coach and a lot of players, so they're probably not going to be very good. And then Austin Peay, Charlotte, these should all be easy wins for Georgia. Looking at that Georgia Tech game on the road, that could be interesting to close out the season. Of course, last year's game was a lot closer than people expected. This is a Georgia Tech program that seems to be on the rise, getting better and better. So that could be a tricky game there at the end. But overall, again, this non-conference schedule, much, much easier for the Georgia Bulldogs in 2025. Let's look at the home and away now. Home games will be against Marshall, Austin Peay, Alabama, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Texas, and Charlotte. So the difference this year is a lot of these big games, some of their toughest opponents, are all at home. Last year they had to play Alabama on the road, had to play Ole Miss on the road, had to play Texas on the road, lost 2 of those 3 games. This year they get those big games at home. You take that and then also add in that non-conference schedule being a lot easier. This is a much more manageable schedule for Georgia, but it's still tough. I mean, you look at the road games, you've got Tennessee. This is going to be a good Tennessee team. This is a team that I think a lot of people maybe will predict to go to the SEC championship. So that's a tough one. Auburn is a team that could be a lot better this year, and that is a tough place to play. You've got Florida, not a road game, not a true road game. It is a neutral site game. It is away from home, of course, playing in Jacksonville. Then you got Mississippi State on the road and Georgia Tech on the road. So yeah, I'm looking at Tennessee, Auburn, Florida, tough games away from home. Georgia Tech even potentially a tough game away from home. But the good news is you get maybe the 3 tough, well, I wouldn't say the 3 toughest games, but 3 of the 4 toughest opponents, 3 of the 5 toughest opponents, you get them at home with Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas. So that's the good news of the schedule. But again, it is a very tough conference schedule, very tough. They will start with Marshall there on August 30th. Then they get Austin Peay on September 6th. And then it's right into SEC play. It's on the road at Tennessee, September 13th. Going to be a huge game. And it seems like these teams usually play closer to the end of the season. So that's going to be a lot different seeing this game. That's kind of that spot where Georgia used to always play South Carolina. But this year they will play Tennessee. And, of course, they don't even play South Carolina. That's a matchup. There are a lot of matchups that I do miss from the old schedules. Like Auburn, LSU. That's a game we saw every year. Alabama, Mississippi State, Georgia, South Carolina. Anyways, back to the schedule. 2 easy games, then Tennessee on the road, and then a bye week before playing Alabama. That's probably a good spot for that bye week because that Alabama game is going to be a big one, and it's coming off of a very tough game against Tennessee. So a good spot for their first bye week. And again, remember, all the teams will have 2 bye weeks, just like last season, just because of the way that the Saturdays fall. So after Alabama, they've got Kentucky on October 4th. We all know how close that game was last year. You feel like it shouldn't be a challenge for Georgia, but it is right in between Alabama and a road game at Auburn. So who knows? Maybe it could be a scary game for them again. But Auburn on the road will be tough, but it's back home after that to face Ole Miss. That's a difficult stretch. When you look at Alabama and then that road game against Auburn and then Ole Miss, it's a difficult stretch, but those 4 games, at least they get 3 of them at home. And if you look at this schedule, they don't have any back-to-back true road games. They do have Florida and Mississippi State away from home, but Mississippi State, we're talking about probably the worst team in the SEC. So they get that bye week after Ole Miss. Then they do play Florida in Jacksonville November 1st. Going to be a huge game. They always get a bye week before that game, and they will get it again this year. Then it's Mississippi State on the road. Again, I don't think Mississippi State's going to be great next year, but let's say they do turn it around and they're much improved. That is a trap game. That has trap game written all over it. It's after a rivalry game against Florida, and it's right before Texas, which will be a huge, huge game. So, potentially a trap game against Mississippi State, but if they're not very good, I mean, it's not going to matter. Georgia should roll. They're just going to have so much more talent. But that's interesting. It's at least noteworthy. You've got Texas, again, on November 15th. Then they'll have an easier game against Charlotte, and they'll close things out with a rivalry game against Georgia Tech on November 29th. We see teams in the SEC a lot of times will have this easy game before their rivalry game. I don't think Georgia usually is one of those teams, but this year they are. And again, Charlotte, and then on the road at Georgia Tech. So I'm looking at, again, this schedule. The Alabama to Ole Miss games, those 4 games in a row, that's going to be a pretty tough stretch. Florida, Mississippi State, Texas, potentially a tough stretch. Depends on how good Mississippi State turns out to be. And again, that's the trap game that I would circle. It's hard to imagine Georgia losing that game right now, but who knows? Again, overall, this schedule in the SEC is going to be tough again. I was actually surprised by this. So if you look at the winning percentage of their opponents, this is their 2024 winning percentage. Again, the 2025 opponents they actually have a losing win percentage, 47%. And I think that's a little bit misleading in terms of the difficulty of the schedule because of the fact that they play Kentucky and Auburn and Mississippi State. So you've got 5 opponents that were not very good last year, or 3 opponents, I should say, that were not very good last year. But then you've got 5 really, really good teams. So those teams bring that win percentage down. And that's why, again, you do look at some easy wins potentially for Georgia, but you also look at some very difficult games in the SEC. So a much easier non-conference schedule, but again, it'll be a tough conference schedule in the SEC for Georgia in 2025. Before we get to the record projection for Georgia, just a quick reminder that memberships are now available on the channel. You can get exclusive emojis, badges, shout outs, also exclusive posts and polls, early access to videos, monthly hangouts, much more. Join us, become a member today. I think a lot of people were surprised to see 2 losses for Georgia in 2024 after what we had seen from them in, of course, previous years. But it was just a tough schedule, and the projection that we had for last year, it actually was 9-3. So they did better than that projection. Here are our projections over the past 4 years and the actual record. Keep in mind, this is not a prediction. It's simply a projection based off of the schedule and the opponents. In 2021, they were projected to go 11-1. They went 12-0. Same thing in 22. In 23, they actually were projected to go 12-0, and they did go 12-0. But last year, 9-3, because of that schedule. It was really tough. Because of that schedule, again, they were projected to lose 3 games, so they actually beat the projection. Georgia has done better than the projection here 3 out of the last 4 years. So keep that in mind as we get into this. Again, here's the schedule, and this is the scale that we use to get this projection. It's all based off of our tier system, our rankings. Georgia is a tier 1 team. So if they're playing a tier 2 team, that game goes to 61 to 70%. That's where that falls in. But if they play that game on the road, it switches it to a 50-50 game, a game in the white. So that's how you can see where the home field advantage plays into this, and then also just the teams that you play and where they are ranked, what tier they're in. That's the formula. Again, not a prediction. It's just a mathematical formula to get a projected record. These projections are usually pretty accurate, usually within a game. Maybe sometimes only, maybe they're in 2 games if a team surprises or has a much better or worse season than expected, but just kind of tells you what to expect and what could be a successful season. If you can do better than these projections, you've had a successful season. And again, Georgia has done that. They have been very successful the last few years. So we will start with the easy games, and I think you've got 5 of them: Marshall, Austin Peay, Kentucky, Mississippi State, and Charlotte. And now Mississippi State game, again, where it's in the schedule between Florida and Texas, it's on the road. It depends on how good Mississippi State is, but they're like one of the lower tier. They're actually in the lowest tier in the Power 4. So just going off of our tier system, that game does turn out to be in the green. Kentucky is a tier above Mississippi State, but that game's at home, so that's the difference there. These are games that Georgia should win. It would be a pretty big shocker if they were to lose any of these games, really. So they should take care of business in those 5 games. And then you've got games in the purple. They've got a bunch of these games where they should be favored, but maybe not by a ton. We're talking about Alabama, Auburn, Ole Miss, Florida, and Georgia Tech. Now, you've got Alabama, Ole Miss, and Florida. Those teams are in a tier below Georgia. That's why they're in the purple. Auburn and Georgia Tech are actually 2 tiers below Georgia, but those games are on the road. That's why they are in the purple. If those games were at home, they'd be in the blue. But because they're in purple, because they're on the road, they are in the purple here again. Auburn, Georgia Tech, games where, I think all of these games here, Georgia Tech's going to be favored by about a touchdown. I'd say, if I was just guessing, probably favored by 6 against Alabama, 9 or 10 against Auburn, 7 or 8 against Ole Miss, 6 or 7 against Florida, 7 or 8 against Georgia Tech. All those do kind of fit into that category. Those are games that Georgia should win if they bring their A game. But when you've got this many games that are in this category, odds are you're going to lose 1 or even 2 of them. And you'll see that when you see the projected record here in just a second. You got Tennessee and Texas. So Texas is tier 1. They're the same tier as Georgia. That's going to be a 50-50 game no matter what. Tennessee, on the other hand, is tier 2. But that game is on the road. That's why it's considered a 50-50 game. So like if you flip Tennessee and Alabama, then the Tennessee game would be in the purple, and Alabama, if it was on the road, it would be in the white. That's just how it works with this formula. So you've got the toughest games of the year, I think, Tennessee and Texas. But then again, you've got a lot of tricky games. Alabama on the road at Auburn, Ole Miss, Florida, and even on the road at Georgia Tech. Those are games where Tennessee will be favored. They'll be a clear favorite, in my opinion, in all 5 of those games. But they won't be enough of a favorite that they're going to run through all those games. I don't think it's going to be tough, I think, for Georgia to win all 5 of those games. So what's the projection? Well, when you've got games in the purple here, these 65%-ish games, odds would tell us they're going to win probably 3 of the 5. So again, odds would say they're going to lose a couple of those games, and then they would split the 50-50 games. So the projection is actually 9-3, same projection as last year, even though they don't play Clemson. I think Georgia Tech being better, having Auburn on the road, some of these factors go in here to kind of replace the Clemson game from last year and give you that same projection. So 9-3, the projected record for Georgia. If they do what they've done in the past, they're probably going to go 10-2 because again, they've beaten the projection by a game almost every year. But if it's a disappointing year, I think even 8-4 is possible. But 9-3, that just given where Georgia has been, I think 9-3 would be a disappointment. But it is, I think, it is the projection here based off of this formula. I think the over/under for Georgia probably winds up at 9.5 with this schedule, maybe even 10.5. So again, I think most people are expecting more, but with our formula, Georgia does come out as a projection of 9-3 in 2025.